Many years ago, I was on a science podcast with a bunch of older men who had kids. And on and off mic over the years, we would talk about gender stereotypes. They insisted that they knew gender stereotypes were, at least in large part, built in because their own children adhered to gender stereotypes despite them receiving no explicit information that said, for instance, girls like princesses and baby dolls and boys like trucks and guns. They found that their daughters, even as infants, just gravitated more towards dolls and princesses and things like that. And I argued that, well, we live in a society and kids are much better at picking up on things than we tend to give them credit for. Our culture, which includes constantly changing stereotypes about men and women, different races, different hairstyles, different ages, all of that, it's the sea that we swim in every day, so we might not notice it, but children are severely impacted by it. This argument was dismissed, of course, because I don't have children, and therefore I could not possibly understand. Ah, well. Anyway, today we're going to talk about a study I discovered randomly and decided to talk about for no particular reason. Certainly not because it just so happens to back up everything I used to say 10 years ago. Just 'cause. The study is called The Unintended Consequences of the Things We Say, What Generics Communicate to Children About Unmentioned Categories, in which the researchers quizzed both children aged 4 to 6 and adults that they found via Mechanical Turk about stereotypes. Not gender stereotypes, but stereotypes about Zarpies and Gorps. You know, Zarpies, those smelly bastards. Disgusting. Nothing like strong, minty, fresh Gorps. They chose Zarpies and Gorps to avoid existing biases clouding up the results. None of the subjects had any pre-existing stereotypes about these two made-up groups of people. So the researchers could watch those stereotypes as they form in real time. And they did that by telling the subjects 8 generic statements about these two groups of people who were completely diverse in terms of race and sex, but who wore either green or yellow depending on whether they were Zarpies or Gorps. The statements were things like, Zarpies are good at baking pizzas, even though everyone knows that Zarpies put pineapple and corn on pizzas like monsters that don't belong in polite society. They didn't include that second part, just the thing about baking pizzas. The researchers found that children as young as 4 didn't just learn from that statement that Zarpies are good at baking pizza. They also extrapolated the idea to the unmentioned group. If someone tells them Zarpies are good at baking pizza, then they tend to assume that that means that Gorps are bad at baking pizza. This was more common the younger the participant. They also ran tests where instead of saying generically Zarpies are good at baking pizzas, they chose a specific Zarpie and said, this Zarpie is good at baking pizza. The effect wasn't as strong, but they did still see it there that when you say this Zarpie is good at baking pizza, a lot of kids still extrapolate to the idea that all Gorps are bad at baking pizza. So what do Zarpies and Gorps have to do with real life? Well, you probably already guessed, but the unfortunate news is that children don't just listen to what you say and take it on its face. They listen to what you aren't saying and they make inferences based on that. So if you happen to say, boys are good at math, many children will extrapolate that to understand and internalize girls are not good at math. If you even say, this boy is good at math, many of them will still infer all boys are good at math and all girls are not good at math. Think of all the times that adults will casually make generic statements around kids, and you might start to see how big of an impact this could have on kids. Like, how about boys don't cry? The researchers suggest that the effect is probably strongest when there's a clear binary, like boy, girl. But of course, it can also apply to a whole host of racial and ethnic stereotypes, even positive ones, like Asians are good at math. Positive discrimination can be harmful to marginalized groups anyway, but this research shows that additionally, you will be subconsciously feeding into a clearly negative stereotype as well. Like, well, Chinese people are good at math, Americans are bad at math, things like that. Humans evolved these big brains that children are expected to fill with knowledge very, very quickly. And because of that, there are all these shortcuts that in most cases are quite helpful. But in many situations, unfortunately, they prove to be limiting. Hearing that prey animals are not dangerous and then assuming that predators are dangerous gets you twice the knowledge just as fast. But it's not always going to be true. And unfortunately, when we learn this stuff at an early age, it can be difficult to tease it out later and correct for biases that we've had for literal decades. That's why the scientific method is so important to the advancement of humanity. And clearly, this is something that I personally have not done the best job of conveying. A few weeks back, I made a video about a study showing that men who are insecure in their masculinity are more likely to respond with aggression when their masculinity is threatened, which could explain why so many men react with violence when asked to wash their hands or wear a mask during a pandemic, considering how we've coded basic hygiene as feminine in Western culture for some reason. In response, one man on Twitter replied, "Actually, the majority of people I've seen act this way have been women." This is derailing at its finest, considering that the study I was discussing wasn't about women, and whether or not they act aggressively may have nothing to do with the reason why men act aggressively. But still, he was wrong. The research is unambiguous in the conclusion that men are significantly less likely to comply with basic hygiene to stop the spread of COVID-19. When I pointed that out, he simply continued to rely on his anecdotal evidence. He refused to believe that his experience is biased. Here's something everyone everywhere needs to know. Your experience is, by definition, biased. So is my experience. Biased. In this particular case, it could be that he's only remembered the times he's seen women throw fits, or it could be because he's including all of the videos he watches online, which may be more likely to gain traction with women in them because our culture loves to bash a Karen more than they love to bash a Kyle. Or it could be that he actually has seen more women being aggressive over masks in person because that's just how the law of averages works. Women make up more than half of the population, so it's certainly possible for one man to see more women aggressively pushing back on pandemic mitigation efforts while someone else notices more men, and someone else also notices more men, and someone else notices more dogs. All of them are experiencing biased opinions that we need to combine in order to see what's actually happening. There's a common joke in skeptic circles that goes, the plural of anecdote isn't evidence, but that's actually wrong. Anecdotes are evidence. They're just not our best evidence because they're biased. So we need to use the scientific method to examine all of these anecdotes and see if they hold up. I grew up knowing that boys just don't cry, and my anecdotal evidence supported it. And if it weren't for people doing good science, then I may still assume today that there's just something hardwired in men that means their only emotion is aggression. I instead corrected my biases. Keep that in mind the next time there's a little kid listening to what you say. You might be teaching them more than you think, and that might not always be a good thing.